Hello St. Lucians, this is Open Mic and we are back here for another program, and once again we wish to thank all of those who pay attention to what we have to say. Today I have with me Mr. John Peters, former Chief Engineer for the Ministry of Works and Communications, and we wish to advise that we're going to have a very extensive and informative debate today on the state of our economy in St. Lucia. As we all know, St. Lucia is going through a very difficult moment at this time. There are major meetings taking place between the government and the trade unions, and if I read the papers correctly today, there seems to be an impasse already in the making. This spells trouble for St. Lucia, and despite the fact that the Prime Minister has indicated that we are to work together, I have not seen the real signs of a true friendship in getting together to arriving at a real consensus. I make those comments in light of what has transpired, because over and over the government has indicated the direction which they want to take as far as a 5% wage reduction amongst the civil servants. Many civil servants are of the opinion that there are other areas which should be directed, and that is the embassies, the consultants, and the extensive social programs which the CSA would like to see addressed before dealing with them. I think the CSA fully understand the situation, but fair is fair, and people who came after they were employed are the ones that should be revisited before major decisions of that nature are taking place. My concern is that an ordinary man selling a postage stamp at the post office or the treasury doing some work, what I call the lower grade people, these are important people because you need those people to function. The areas and the consultants that the CSA speak about feel that even though there was a break for at least 3 years from those people, it would make no difference to the running of the island. Thirdly, the Prime Minister has created, as we know, several commissions to assist him in what is going on. The last one being one to revisit the financing of the country along with them. But both my take and that of Mr. Peters is we are of the opinion that if you have ministers in government in charge of the finance department paying salaries, these are the individuals that should be coming up with those decisions. It is all well and good to have a group of people, but from my experience, being an outsider, running as what you call a council, these councils have very little teeth, and we have seen in the past that they have produced very little. So on that score, I'm now going to call upon Mr. Peters to highlight a bit more of my concerns with some figures which he has in his possession so that we can enlighten the public in the direction we're going. Mr. Peters.
Yes, well, good day, and I want to thank you, Mr. Shastny, for inviting me once again to your program. I think what is important for us as a country, as a people, is to first understand how we got into this position that we are in at this point in time. I do recognize it is indeed a significant situation that we have found ourselves in, and I call it a state of war that we are in. But it's important to go back to find out, and I've traced it back to the last 16, 18 years to see exactly how this debt crisis that we are faced with came about. I went to the government website and did some research on the internet just to get an idea as to how our debt stood in 2007. And I just want to go through
some figures.
here. Under domestic debt, we had RBTT, government owed 17.4 million. Barbados Mutual, 7.5 million. National Savings and Bonds, $69.9 million. FCIB, 104.6 million. Regional Securities Market Bonds, 253.2 million. Under external debt, we had Royal Merchant Bank at 196.7 million. Citibank Limited, 109.2 million. National Savings and Bonds, 34.8 million. Regional Securities Market Bonds, 53.7 million. And under the bilateral loans, we had AFD, which the French department, 60.9, Kuwait Fund, 19.6 million, CDB, $323.3 million, European Investment Bank, 1.9 million, IFAD, 2.6, UPED, 2 million, World Bank, $149.7 million, and a private company, Ariane Sportwoodle, 2.1 million, totaling as at March 2007, 1.41 billion EC dollars.
In 2007?
In 2007.
Right.
Then I went to see what happened at the end of March 2012. In March 2012, the figure had moved up from 1.41 billion to 2.27 billion, an increase of $862 million, or an average of $172.5 million per year that was borrowed in that particular period of time. So we have been involved in significant borrowing. Now, one of the metrics that is used, and sometimes I believe my reading is saying, is that we have been so pushed, we have been pushed into listening to this debt to GDP ratio. But from what the economists are saying now is that the debt to GDP ratio does not focus on the composition of debt, nor on the maturity structure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we begin to deconstruct the debt that we have at this point in time, there are certain significant things that come to the fore. One is that we have a very large amount of short-term debt at commercial rates. We have a lot of bonds at this point in time that are also short-term and also at some commercial rate interest. So where we have found ourselves now is in essence a cash flow problem, in that you have a bunching up of payments on these short-term loans, and you do not have the cash coming in
to deal with
that. Mm-hmm. And then what has happened is that what governments were doing over the last couple of years is that to meet some of these payments, they went out and take additional bonds. So we were taking bonds to pay for bonds that were becoming due, and taking bonds to pay for another bond that came due.
A question for you, John. The list of debts that the government had in 2007, what were the average interest rates on those debts?
Those interest rates would have run probably from 5 to 7%.
And when they started taking the bonds, what kind of interest were they paying then?
These interest, but interestingly, because in 2012 there was a prospectus done for $140 million that the government was seeking to borrow. Those rates were ranging from 6% to 7.5%.
So what you're telling me there, if you were running from 5% to 6.7%, you're talking about at least a 1.5% increase. So in other words, you were borrowing money at a higher rate by taking a loan to pay a loan.
To pay a loan. And that is because your debt to GDP ratio was increasing.
Yes.
Then your risk factor was also changing.
You're becoming more exposed.
You're more exposed, and therefore your interest rate increased. So we were taking higher interest loans to pay off loans.
Yeah.
And that is the sort of treadmill that we found ourselves in.
You have been in the Public Works Department, you have seen the level of expenditure in the infrastructure and the need to produce. What would you have done differently?
Now, it's interesting that you ask that question, because as I was saying to you, what is important to look at is your composition of debt and your maturity structure. How is this loan going to be repaid and what period of time,
Right.
and the interest rate. So when you begin to deconstruct, as I said, and you start to look at how these loans were used, one of the things with the bond market is that while it is good that we had set up this in 2002, this regional securities market bond through the ECB, in which OECS countries can raise bonds and whatever.
Right.
One of the problems happened was that there was no constraint on the purpose of the use of these funds. So a government can go out and raise a bond for $100 million, and if they wish, decide to buy a jet plane.
Correct.
And say, okay, well, we want a jet plane now because...
So there was no supervision, so to speak.
There is no
guidance.
There is no restriction,
there were no constraints
on the utilization of bond money.
And that was the start of our problems.
And I think that is what happened, in that unlike a bilateral loan from the CDB will say
you have
to you,
guidelines.
First, you have to do a feasibility study.
Correct.
They want to know that this project, there is some economic analysis done. They want to know that there's a return. Then they also establish some discipline in the procurement and a discipline in how the money is disbursed. When you take out a bond, there's no such discipline that is involved in it. I can take my money and do what I want with it.
You know, John, it's so funny you should mention this, because I happen to be at least 4 to 5 meetings when the presentation of the bonds were being made to the various prime ministers. And at the time, I look at the faces of all the individuals, the directors of finance, the prime ministers who were taking those loans, and everybody seemed so happy that they were able to raise those bonds and this flow of money was coming in. And I did ask myself the question, but wait a while, is someone checking the extent to which those loans are being made, those bonds are being sold, and how we're going to pay for them? But I had a level of confidence in the fact that there's a Ministry of Finance. These are people who are educated, who are supposed to know what they're doing, and keeping proper records of where this is going. But you have raised a very valid point, as I never really thought of before, is that when these people got this money, they were under no obligation to go and they were not answerable to anyone but themselves. So they took that money and they put it in areas, evidently, that they saw fit, which today has undoubtedly proved a futile experience. I want you to go ahead from there.
Yeah, because what has happened is that where the funds were placed, there is no economic return.
Right.
And there is no growth in the economy coming out of the investment that has been placed. Wherever it has been placed. And that is the problem. So you have a situation now where there are no inflows from your projects that you have invested. There is no net economic activity. And therefore you find yourself in a situation now where you have a cash flow problem. So we have a cash flow problem.
Correct.
We have a debt problem. But more importantly, we have a cash flow problem, in that we do not have sufficient cash to run our affairs.
You know, John, many years ago, I listened to Sir John Compton talking about borrowings, and I didn't understand fully what he said, but he indicated that when you borrow money, the money should be used in circles and not in squares. I honestly did not understand what he was saying, but I have subsequently asked what he meant, and exactly what he said. When you borrow money, that money, when it's in a circle, people benefit from it because it circulates. But when you do it in squares, it gets stuck in corners. Apparently, what has happened now, although I hate to lay blame on people because there's certain aspects of investment which are necessary. For instance, we discussed for a long time, we wanted a prison. We wanted to increase and better our police stations, our fire stations, and under the Labour government, most of those projects were undertaken. And in one sense, I wish to commend the Labour Party for what they have done. But it seems to me now the chickens have come home to roost, because these monies were taken and they had a breathing spell for 6 or 7 years and they have to be repaid. And what has happened? That has now choked us off, because these monies now have to take precedence over the social projects, and also not only the social projects, but to be able to proceed with getting the country on stream by honoring their debts. So where do we go from there?
But I do agree with you that some of the social projects were extremely useful. I mean,
Correct. The prison is one.
The prison,
it's absolutely necessary.
Our prison now is world class. I mean, I'll say that to you. Bordelais, in relation to what exists in all the Caribbean islands,
yes,
stands out.
No question about it. Yes,
yeah.
I agree.
Model facility, correctional facility. The investment in police stations and fire stations are worthy of investment.
Yeah.
What I may have a problem with is if I'm taking loan money and giving it to somebody to cut grass along the highway. That I have a serious problem with. And I have seen, and I have no problems with the STEP program as it's constructed. I have no problems with people being facilitated in short-term employment.
Yeah. John, this is a very important step we're taking, which is going to be a bit lengthy. We have to take our first break. This is Open Mic. We'll be right back.